The quiet autumn afternoon stretched across the pine trees west of Millbrook. On the wooden bench on the porch, Margaret sat silently, her cup of mint tea still steaming lightly in her palm. The late afternoon sunlight shone on her hair, sparkling like golden ash. At 61 years old, she was retired, living alone in the small house that she and her husband had renovated more than 30 years ago. His death 5 years ago left the house empty, but not lonely. Because every afternoon, when the sunlight began to recede, memories of Samuel came back. Samuel, her childhood friend, the one she thought would disappear with time like everyone else. But no. Samuel had been gone for a long time, at the age of 33. But his presence still lived in every corner of Margaret's memory, like a ray of sunlight that never completely faded in her heart. They met when they were very young. Margaret worked in the university library and Samuel was a final-year medical student. Brilliant, sharp, and very good at asking questions that made people think silently. One day, he walked into the library and put Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death on the counter. Margaret remembered the question clearly. Do you believe that one can learn to accept death? Margaret, then only 26 years old, answered without hesitation. I think we should learn to live first. Samuel smiled, his eyes as deep as the night sky. That's what I'm trying to learn. Their friendship grew from there. Late-night coffees after shifts, walks in the park in the middle of winter, endless but emotional conversations. Even though there was no romantic love between them, their bond was special in a profound way. As if they were two lost souls, finding a little peace in each other's presence. Then Samuel fell ill. Brain cancer. No warning, no negotiation. Just a lingering headache, a fainting spell in the operating room. And everything changed. He fought on for almost 2 years. During that time he did not retreat. On the contrary, Samuel lived more intensely than ever. He wrote, read, talked to patients, and most importantly, recorded his thoughts in an old leather-bound notebook. A week before he died, Samuel called Margaret. He lay in his hospital bed, much thinner but still bright-eyed. I want you to keep this, he said, handing her the notebook. Don't read it yet. Wait until you need it. Margaret kept the notebook for more than 20 years, placing it on a bookshelf as a memory to be gently preserved. It was not until her husband died, when the house suddenly became too quiet and questions about the meaning of life began to awaken, that she opened it. The first page contained only one line. Death does not take away life. It only highlights what is truly important. Each page that followed contained a short paragraph. Sometimes a note about a patient, sometimes an unfinished poem, sometimes an unanswered question. But all of them focused on one thing. How to live fully, not long but deep enough. Another passage haunted her for years. I used to think that saving lives was the highest goal of a doctor. But now I understand. Helping others face the truth while maintaining dignity, still seeing the beauty of life. That is the greatest gift. After reading the notebook, Margaret began to live differently. Not in a big way. Not transforming herself into someone new. She just returned to the things she had put off. She called her sister, whom she had been separated from since she was 40 because of a trivial misunderstanding. She replanted the flower garden behind the house. Not because it was beautiful, but because she remembered what Samuel had said. Plants do not fear winter. They only rest to bloom again. She wrote a handwritten letter to her son, saying that she was sorry for always having such high expectations when he was young. And every night, when the warm yellow light shone through the glass door, she sat by the window, her hand resting on the tattered notebook, her heart feeling light. 12 years later, Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at the age of 73. When the doctor told her, she just smiled. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew she had enough time to live truly, love truly, and forgive truly. She rewrote the notebook. Not to copy what Samuel had written, but to continue writing. For herself. And for her granddaughter who had just turned 10, who she hoped would read it one day and understand. Between life and death is a journey, where you don't have to go very far, just go very deep. On a late autumn afternoon, when the sun was thin and the wind was rustling through the pines, Margaret closed her eyes on the wooden chair on the porch. Not a word of complaint. Not a single regret. In her coat pocket there was a small notebook. And a handwritten note. To Samuel. I have lived as you have lived. And I know you are still somewhere smiling. That winter came earlier than usual. Snow covered the porch of the wooden house in Millbrook, painting the ground a quiet white. The bare branches swayed gently in the wind, creating a soft melody that echoed through the window. Margaret was no longer sitting on the rocking chair. The small house now belonged to Amy, the niece she often mentioned in the last pages of the notebook. Amy was 22 years old this year, a senior in nursing. She came to Millbrook after Margaret's funeral. A simple warm ceremony, without as many tears as people thought. Only the closest people were there, and a soft piano music played as a gentle farewell. The house felt strange to Amy at first. But after a few days, she began to feel the warmth her grandmother left behind. In every hand-knitted scarf, every jar of orange jam with the Christmas 2022 label, and especially the notebook. Amy found it in her nightstand drawer. The first page was in Samuel's neat handwriting, a name she knew only vaguely as her special friend, and contained thoughtful lines about life, death, and connection. On the next few pages, the writing changed to a softer handwriting, her grandmother's. Each line seemed to take Amy through a moment in Margaret's life. The heartaches, the awakenings, and above all, a calm belief in the value of each breath. We cannot keep the people we love forever, Margaret wrote, but we can live in such a way that their memory becomes light, not darkness, in our hearts. One evening, as the snow fell harder, Amy made herself a cup of hot cocoa, sat by the fire, and read the last few pages. Her aunt had written as if she knew Amy would read it. If you're holding this book, it means I'm gone. But I want you to remember. Life isn't about proving anything, it's about feeling. Don't rush to find something great. Sometimes, sitting next to someone in silence is a great thing. Amy closed the book. She didn't cry. But her heart was filled with a strange feeling. Both loss and gratitude. She knew that she had inherited not just the house, but a spiritual legacy of a woman who had learned to live, thanks to a friend who had learned to die. And that night, for the first time since her grandmother died, Amy sat on the porch swing in the cold snow. She said nothing. She just looked up at the sky and whispered, "I heard you, Grandma. And I will live deeply." I started gardening at age 63 months after my wife died. We had a small garden behind the house, where she grew everything from lavender and roses to rows of scraggly carrots that the grandchildren would grin at when they pulled out the big ones. I never touched it. I was an office worker with a mind for spreadsheets, not soil. After the funeral, the house felt eerily empty. She was always the one who talked, sang, and lovingly scolded me for not remembering to water the plants. Now no one reminded me. The garden began to wither, too, as if it were in mourning. One afternoon, I went out to the garden and stood looking at the dead flowers. I don't know why I picked up the trowel. Maybe it was because I wanted to see something come back to life. Maybe it was because I needed something to do to forget the sigh in my chest. The first week, I didn't plan anything. I just pulled weeds, dug the soil, and gathered up the dead branches. Strangely, when my hands touched the soil, I didn't think too much about death. I thought about the first time we moved into this house. She had cried like a child when she saw the backyard. I started sowing seeds, but not the flowers my wife had grown. I chose plants I had never heard of, something new. Not to forget her, but to start a new chapter, one where I would have to live alone, but not alone. A month later, heavy rains flooded the garden. I despaired, thinking that all my efforts had been in vain. But then a week later, amidst the soggy soil, a sprout still emerged, as if life were telling me, everything will grow again in its own way. 3 months later, I had a new garden. It wasn't as beautiful as before, but it was mine. The first garden I had ever tended myself, and the second garden in my life, where I learned to love again from the beginning. I understood that, after loss, we cannot go back to the way things were. But we can start again, slowly, gently sprouting. Like that garden, I was no longer the same person I was before. I was an old version, but I had learned to live on. And tonight, as I sit here, under the silver moonlight shining on that second garden, I feel at peace. Not because the pain has gone away, but because I have learned to live with it as part of the earth. Someone asked me why I didn't plant the flowers she loved. Lavender, dahlias, climbing roses. I just smiled and said, because they were hers. It sounds strange, but for me, the old garden was part of the world we lived in together. And this garden, the second garden, is where I learned to live when I was alone. The truth is, I used to dread the mornings. She used to wake up before me, sing softly in the kitchen, make tea, sometimes turn on the radio to listen to old country music. After she left, the house was so quiet that I almost went crazy. The only sound was the ticking of the clock, reminding me that with each passing second, I had to endure a little more longing. But the garden taught me something else. The dawn was not just the start of a new day.
It was a reminder that I still had time to live. The first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees onto the dewy ground were a sign that said, today is also an opportunity. A chance to grow, to forgive, to remember, and to move on. I started keeping a record of what I grew. Each plant, each flowering day, each bee that visited. I named each clump not after people, but after the emotions I was experiencing. There was a yellow chrysanthemum bush called Hope, which grew from a seed I thought was dead. A row of mint called Peace, because the smell always made me breathe deeper. Sometimes, I still look up at the old bedroom window where she used to stand watching me work in the garden. I wonder if she were still alive, would she like the new garden? Then I think, maybe she would laugh and tell me I finally learned how to water plants without drowning the roots. One afternoon in late autumn, as I was pruning the dead branches, a neighbor boy came up to the fence. He asked, "Grandpa, why do you have so many plants?" I thought for a moment and said, "Because plants don't talk, but they listen." It was the least of my expectations. The garden was not just a place to plant, but also a silent friend. When I was sad, it did not comfort me. When I cried, it did not ask. But every time I put my hands in the soil, I felt something deep inside me rise up, a calming, an acceptance, a slow forgiveness. The first winter after she left was the coldest I've ever experienced. Not because of the weather, but because of the memories. There was no one to cook dinner for the holidays, no one to wrap presents. But the garden, dormant though it was, had something warm about it. I saw new shoots still trying to push through the cold soil. I learned that life doesn't disappear. It just retreats temporarily, waiting for another spring. And spring did come, a real spring with new things. I started joining a community gardening group, making friends with people who had also lost loved ones. We told each other stories, not to lament, but to understand that grief is something we all go through, but we don't have to go through it alone. I'm 70 now. My second garden is no longer a place to escape sadness. It's part of me, like my wrinkles, my gray hair, my voice that gets hoarser with age. It is where I cried, learned, healed, and truly lived. I don't know how many springs I have left, but I know tomorrow morning I will still go out to the garden. I will pick up a few fallen leaves, water them a little, and sit back on the old wooden chair. In my hand is a cup of hot tea. In my ears is the sound of birdsong. And in my heart, a peaceful garden where I learn the most important lesson of my life. That after loss, we can still live, not by forgetting, but by sowing.